Hello, everyone. I'm the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you. Today, I know you're using this video to fall asleep. So, take a deep breath and let the worries of the day fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It truly helps. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now get cozy. Close your eyes and let's begin your journey to deep relaxation. The stars stretched across the heavens like scattered diamonds, their quiet glow casting silver ribbons over the vast lands below. Middle-earth lay wrapped in the hush of night, the sea whispering its ancient song upon the western shores of Gondor, while in the east, the dark silhouette of the withered heath loomed against the sky, jagged peaks standing like sentinels over the forgotten ruins of time. The world slumbered beneath the heavens, but deep within the grand halls of Minas Tirith, a single candle flickered against the restless air. Lord Arundel traced the brittle edges of the parchment before him, his calloused fingers following the faded ink of a map long thought lost to time. His sharp gaze lingered on the delicate script, old whispers of legend nearly swallowed by the passing of ages. He had spent his life chasing knowledge, sifting through ruins and forgotten tomes. But this was different. It was not a myth. It was real. The map depicted something hidden beneath the volcanic peaks of the withered heath. Not merely ruins, but a forge, one crafted in the shadows of the First Age by the last of Morgoth's blacksmiths. A place where fire once burned black, where weapons of terrible power had been shaped in darkness, and where echoes of the past still lingered upon the stone. If the legends were true, something still lay buried beneath, waiting. The mere thought sent a chill through him, a quiet storm rising beneath his composed exterior. A soft knock at the door pulled Arundel from his thoughts. He straightened, his expression schooled into calm. Enter. His voice did not waver, though his mind raced. The heavy door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, movements fluid and silent. Cloaked in a traveler's garb, hood drawn low over their face, they moved with the grace of one who had long learned to walk unseen. Yet, Arundel knew them the moment they stepped into the light. The quiet certainty of their step, the weight of an old presence that could not be mistaken. The hood fell back, revealing sharp elven features, silver-gray eyes that held the weight of ages past. Thalen met his gaze, ancient and piercing, her voice soft as wind through forgotten halls. "I came as you requested," she murmured, though her gaze had already fallen to the parchment upon the table. "But I had not expected this." Arundel allowed the ghost of a smile to touch his lips. "I hoped you would come, Thalen." She stepped closer, her fingers ghosting over the fragile parchment. The lost forge of the enemy. Her tone was unreadable. "This is what you seek." "I do." He folded his hands before him, and I need your help to find it." Thalen was silent for a long moment. The years had changed her, but Arundel still recognized the stillness in her when she was weighing something deeply. She had spent decades wandering Middle-earth, avoiding the affairs of both men and elves. And yet, she was here. She had answered his summons when she could have ignored it. "The whispers of this place have been buried for a reason," she murmured at last. "Some would call it folly to stir them again, and some would call it folly to leave such a place unguarded," Arundel countered. "I do not seek to wield what lies beneath the mountain, nor do I wish to see it fall into the wrong hands." He met her gaze without hesitation. "But knowledge, Thalen, knowledge, is our greatest weapon against the darkness that ever lingers beyond the horizon." She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled softly, as though releasing something unseen. With quiet resolution, she pulled a chair closer and sat across from him, resting her fingertips upon the table's edge. "Tell me everything." By the time dawn's first light touched the white walls of Minas Tirith, the decision had been made. The expedition would begin within a fortnight, their path winding northward through Rohan into the scorched lands of the withered heath. The company would be small, chosen for loyalty and strength, for the road ahead would not be easy. Arundel sent word to Doran's heir, a dwarven warrior who had long sought vengeance for his fallen kin. If any understood the ways of fire and stone, it was he. He also sought Baron, an Easterling deserter who had traveled farther than most, who had claimed to have seen the dark fire still smoldering beneath the mountains. If there was truth to his words, they would need him. The days passed, the weight of what lay ahead settling upon them all. On the eve of their departure, Arundel stood upon the ramparts of the city, watching the stars wheel above him. The night wind carried the scent of the fields below, the murmur of the Anduin as it wound its way toward the sea. For a fleeting moment, doubt curled at the edges of his mind. Were they meddling in something best left undisturbed? Then he heard it, a whisper, faint as the wind, curling at the edges of his thoughts. It did not come from the city below, nor from the company gathered within its walls. It came from somewhere else, distant, yet near, ancient, waiting. A shiver ran through him. He turned sharply, gripping the stone parapet to steady himself. The journey had not yet begun, and already something was stirring. The road stretched before them, winding away from the white walls of Minas Tirith and into the rolling plains of Rohan. The dawn had barely broken when they set out, their small company riding in silence as the first light of morning cast long shadows over the land. The air was crisp with the lingering chill of night, the scent of damp earth rising from the fields. Arundel rode at the head, his cloak billowing behind him, the weight of purpose pressing against his shoulders. He He had traveled this path before, but never with such uncertainty coiling within him. Knowledge was a torch against the dark, a guiding light through the unknown. But as they rode toward the forgotten past, he wondered if some doors were never meant to be opened. Beside him, Thalen moved with the effortless grace of the Eldar, her silver eyes scanning the horizon. She had been silent for much of the morning, though Arundel could sense the weight of thought pressing upon her. She had not refused to come, but neither had she fully committed herself to this course. Not yet. You feel it, don't you? She asked suddenly, her voice soft but edged with certainty. Arundel did not answer immediately. His gaze followed hers, watching as the wind stirred through the golden fields of Rohan, whispering through the tall grasses like unseen fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was slower than usual, each word weighed before release. I feel something, he admitted, but I cannot name it. Thalen inclined her head slightly, as if she had expected this answer. It is the weight of a door half opened, she murmured. A path glimpsed, but not yet walked. The moment before certainty, when the shape of things to come remains unseen. Arundel exhaled softly. You speak as though this path is already decided, he said, glancing at her. As if we are bound to what lies ahead. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Perhaps we are, she said. Or perhaps we are merely walking toward what was always waiting for us. A shiver ran through him, though the air was not cold. He had always believed in choice, in the shaping of one's own destiny. Yet, there was something undeniable in her words, something that lingered in the space between thought and feeling. Behind them, a voice rumbled through the quiet. The mountains call to us, Doran's air muttered, his deep voice like the shifting of stone. And they do not call kindly. Baron, who had ridden in silence at the rear, lifted his gaze toward the horizon. The peaks of the withered heath loomed faintly in the distance, their shapes veiled in the haze of the rising sun. He said nothing, but his expression darkened. Arundel tightened his grip on the reins. Then, let us answer the call. They rode on, the day stretching long before them. The land began to change, the rich green of Rohan fading into dry earth and rocky outcroppings. The wind grew sharper, carrying with it a scent that was not entirely unfamiliar. Smoke, faint but lingering. Thalen tensed slightly beside him, her senses keener than those of men. Arundel smelled it too, the scent of burned stone, of fire that had not yet forgotten its hunger. Doran grunted. The earth remembers fire, he murmured, even when it sleeps. Arundel did not disagree. The ground beneath them had once known the weight of dragonfire, and though the great beasts were long gone, their presence had never fully faded. The silence stretched long between them as they pressed onward. The sky darkened as the afternoon waned, thick clouds gathering overhead. The wind curled around them, whispering through the broken land like unseen fingers. Then, at last, Thalen spoke again. Her voice was quieter now, but there was something in it that made Arundel's skin prickle. "This land is not merely empty," she murmured. "It is watching." Arundel exhaled slowly. "You speak as though it is alive." Thalen shook her head. "Not alive," she said after a pause, "but not dead either. Some places do not belong entirely to the past. They linger caught between what was and what still might be. And in such places, the old things do not slumber as deeply as we might wish." Doran's heir, ever attuned to the ways of stone, ran a thick hand over his braided beard, his keen dwarven eyes fixed on the mountains ahead. "There is fire here," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "But fire is only one kind of hunger." Baron, who had been listening without speaking, finally let out a slow breath. "You speak of the mountain as if it breathes." Doran did not turn to look at him, but his fingers curled slightly over the hilt of his axe. "All things that have known fire remember it," he murmured. "Even the stone." Baron said nothing for a long moment. Then, shaking his head, he muttered, "Then let us hope the mountain does not choose to wake while we walk upon its skin." The words lingered between them, unspoken yet understood. The land continued to change as they rode. The grasses of Rohan had long since vanished, replaced by stretches of darkened rock, seamed with cracks where molten rivers had once flowed. The withered heath loomed before them now, not merely a distant shadow upon the horizon, but a presence that could be felt. The weight of it pressed upon them, thick in the air, in their very breath, and in the heart of it, deep beneath the mountains, something stirred. The last traces of Rohan lay behind them, lost to the distance as the withered heath stretched wide before them. The land was scarred, its surface a jagged tapestry of blackened rock and dry, cracked earth. No trees grew here. No birds called from above. It was a place where the past clung to the very bones of the world, where time itself wavered between memory and silence. Arundel urged his horse forward, the beast's hooves striking against brittle ground. The company rode in silence, each of them feeling the weight of the place settle upon their shoulders like an unseen presence. The sky above had grown pale and hazy, veiled in wisps of cloud, reluctant to part. The scent of fire lingered in the air, not fresh, not immediate, but ancient, like the last breath of a flame refusing to be extinguished. Thalen rode beside him, her silver-gray eyes scanning the horizon with quiet intensity. She had not spoken since the land had begun to shift, but Arundel could sense her unease. He felt it too. It was not fear, not yet, but something close. "The stone is watching," Doran muttered from behind them, his deep voice cutting through the hush. "It does not forget." Baron, who had been quiet for much of the journey, glanced toward the dwarf. "You sound as though you think the mountain itself holds memory." Doran ran a hand over his thick beard. "Stone remembers," he said simply. "You may not hear it, but it does." His sharp eyes flickered toward Arundel. "And when it speaks, it is wise to listen." Arundel nodded, though he was not sure he wished to hear what the earth had to say. The wind shifted, curling low over the land, carrying a sound with it, a whisper, faint as the sigh of shifting rock. Arundel's fingers tightened on the reins. It was easy to dismiss such things as mere tricks of the wind, the restless shifting of the world's breath. But this was different. Thalen heard it too. Her gaze snapped to Arundel, and though she said nothing, he understood. They pressed on. As the afternoon waned, the land grew harsher. The rock formations rose higher around them, jagged outcroppings forming narrow pathways that coiled deeper into the belly of the heath. The sunlight barely reached these places, swallowed by ridges that cast long shadows over the broken earth. The silence became heavier, the air thick with an unspoken presence. Then abruptly they came upon it, a ruin. It stood crumbling before them, half buried in the embrace of time, its stones darkened by fire and age. It had once been a great hall of that, there was no doubt. Though the walls had long since collapsed, the remnants of pillars still jutted from the earth like the ribs of some long-dead beast. Old carvings, worn to near obscurity, stretched along the fallen stone. Their meaning was lost, save for the faintest traces of artistry that remained. Thalen dismounted first, stepping lightly over the broken ground. She ran her fingers along one of the fallen pillars, tracing the faint lines of the ancient script. "This place has seen fire," she murmured. "Not the fire of war, nor the fire of creation, but something deeper, something that lingers." Arundel stepped beside her, his gaze sweeping the ruins. "You speak as though the past is still here." Thalen exhaled softly. "Some places do not let go of what they once were." Doran approached, his broad fingers running over the stone with a craftsman's eye. "Dwarven work," he muttered, "but old, older than any stronghold still standing." He knelt, brushing away dirt and ash from the base of a ruined archway, his brow furrowed. This place was not built to house a kingdom. It was built to guard something. Arundel's heart quickened. A forge. Doran did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood, his gaze drifting toward the distant peaks that loomed over them. "Perhaps," he said at last, "but if it was meant to be forgotten." The wind stirred again, curling through the ruins like an unseen breath. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with something unspoken, something waiting. Baron, who had kept his distance, crossed his arms. If it was forgotten, then why does it feel as though something here still remembers? No one answered. They made camp among the ruins, their fire a small, flickering light against the vast emptiness of the heath. The stars above burned cold, distant beacons in a sky that seemed too vast, too watchful. Arundel sat near the flames, staring at the maps spread before him. The path was clear, northward still, toward the black peaks that swallowed the horizon. The forge lay ahead, buried in the mountain's depths, but it no longer felt as though they were simply seeking something lost. It felt as though they were being drawn forward. Thalen sat across from him, her gaze unreadable in the firelight. "You feel it, don't you?" Arundel met her eyes. The weight of something unfinished. She nodded. "This place does not simply wait, it calls." Doran, who had been listening, let out a slow breath. "The mountain breathes," he murmured, "and if we are not careful, we will wake whatever sleeps beneath it." Baron exhaled sharply. "Then, perhaps the question is not whether we will find this forge," he said, "but whether we should." The night stretched long around them, heavy with things unspoken, and in the distance, beneath the earth, something stirred. Morning arrived slowly, its light struggling to pierce the mist that clung to the ruins. The company broke camp in silence, burdened by thoughts they did not speak aloud. The night had passed without incident, yet none of them had truly rested. The weight of the land pressed upon them, its presence felt in every breath, in every whisper of wind through the broken stones. Arundel led them onward, the ruins fatting behind them as they pressed deeper into the heath. The path ahead was no longer a path at all, only jagged ridges of blackened rock and deep fissures, where the earth had cracked beneath the weight of forgotten fire. The ground here was treacherous, brittle in places, shifting in ways that suggested it had not yet fully settled. As they rode, the scent of sulfur thickened in the air. Doran, who had been silent for much of the morning, suddenly reined in his horse, his brow furrowing as he studied the ground beneath them. "Something is wrong," he muttered. Arundel turned to him. "What do you see?" Doran dismounted, kneeling to press a calloused hand against the earth. He was still for a long moment, his eyes half closed, as if listening to something just beyond hearing. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, heavier. "The stone beneath us is hollow." A hush fell over them. Arundel exchanged a glance with Thalen, who had already slid from her saddle, crouching to run her fingers over the fractured ground. She did not speak immediately, but when she lifted her gaze to his, Her silver eyes were dark with understanding. "There is something beneath us," she murmured. Doran nodded grimly. "A chamber, a cavern, perhaps, and it is not as deep as it should be." Baron shifted uneasily in his saddle. "If there is open space beneath, then how much of this ground can be trusted to hold our weight?" Doran stood, brushing dust from his palms. "Not much." The air around them felt different now, as if the very land had drawn breath. Arundel could not shake the sense that they were walking upon something that was not truly still, that the heath itself had not finished shifting beneath them. Thalen stepped lightly over the cracked earth, her movements precise and deliberate. "There may be a way down," she said, glancing toward the rising slopes ahead. "The forge, if it exists, would not have been built in open air. It would be within the mountain itself." Arundel nodded. "Then we find the entrance." They pressed onward, moving cautiously now, their pace slower as they navigated the unstable ground. The ridges around them grew taller, the rock formations twisting into strange, unnatural shapes, as if warped by forces beyond mere time. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, yet it seemed unable to truly warm the land. Even as sweat gathered beneath Arendel's collar, the air felt cold, heavy, with something unseen. Then at last they found it. The entrance lay at the base of a towering ridge, a jagged fissure in the rock, yawning open like the mouth of some ancient beast. It was not a natural formation. The edges were too smooth, the shape too deliberate. This was no mere cave. It had been carved, shaped by hands long since turned to dust. Doran exhaled sharply. "Dwarf work," he muttered, "but not by my kin." Thalen moved closer, running her fingers lightly over the stone. Faint markings, nearly lost to time, were etched into the rock's surface. She traced them carefully, her expression unreadable. "This script," she murmured, "it is old, older than the Second Age, perhaps older than the First." Arundel stepped beside her, studying the carvings. The markings were unlike anything he had seen before, jagged, almost violent in their form, as if etched with force rather than care. "They do not belong to elves," he said, "nor to men, nor even to dwarves." "Then who built it?" Baron asked. For a long moment, no one answered. Then Thalen exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "The servants of Morgoth." The words sent a chill through the group. Even Baron, who had long since abandoned fear, shifted uneasily. Doran's grip tightened on the hilt of his axe. If they built it, then nothing good lies within. Arundel felt the weight of that truth settle upon him. But he did not turn back. He had come too far for that. Slowly, he stepped forward, into the mouth of the tunnel. The air changed the moment he crossed the threshold. It was as though he had stepped into another world. The warmth of the sun vanished, replaced by a cold that had nothing to do with the absence of light. The tunnel stretched downward, its walls lined with veins of rock that gleamed faintly in the dimness, as though remnants of long-cooled fire still lingered within them. The others followed, their footfalls echoing against the stone, the sound swallowed quickly by the tunnel's depths. The path sloped steeply downward, and with each step, the air grew heavier. The silence pressed closer. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the passage widened. They emerged into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in darkness. The floor beneath them was smooth, unnatural in its perfection. Across the chamber, carved into the very bones of the mountain, lay a doorway. Massive, unbroken by time, its surface covered in runes that pulsed with a dim, eerie glow. Doran's breath hitched. This is no mere ruin. Thalen's fingers tightened at her sides. No, it is not. Arundel swallowed. The forge was here. He could feel it. The heat, though faint, was unmistakable. It had never gone cold, and in the silence that followed, something stirred in the dark. The silence in the cavern was vast, pressing in from all sides like the weight of the mountain itself. The dim glow of the runes carved into the great doorway pulsed faintly, casting shifting shadows against the smooth stone floor. The air here was thick, not just with dust and time, but with something else, something unseen yet unmistakably present. Arundel stepped forward, his boots echoing slightly in the immense space. He could feel the warmth now, subtle but undeniable, radiating from the doorway ahead. It was not the dry warmth of stone long basked in the sun, nor the suffocating heat of open flame. It was something deeper, like embers buried beneath the surface of the world, waiting for breath to stir them back to life. Thalen moved beside him, her silver eyes tracing the runes with quiet intensity. "These symbols," she murmured, "they are not merely names or markings. They are wards." Doran grunted. Wards against what? Thalen hesitated before answering, her fingers barely grazing the carved stone. Against intrusion. Her voice dropped lower. Or perhaps against something within. The words sent a ripple of unease through the group. Even Baron, who had long since abandoned superstition, exhaled sharply. Then, why does it feel as if the door is waiting to be opened? Arundel said nothing. He did not need to. The truth was there, unspoken but understood. The forge had not been abandoned. It had been sealed. Doran stepped forward, his broad hands tightening on the haft of his axe. "This door was meant to hold something in," he muttered. "Yet the heat still lingers behind it." His eyes flickered toward Arundel. If the fire was meant to die, it did not obey. Baron turned toward him, his expression unreadable. And if it was never meant to die, no one answered. Thalen inhaled slowly. "There is a presence here," she said. "It does not feel dormant." She turned toward Arundel. "Whatever lies beyond this door, it has waited a long time." Arundel looked up at the towering entrance, at the carvings etched deep into the surface. He could not decipher them, but they stirred something within him, a whisper just beyond the reach of understanding. He had always believed in knowledge, in the pursuit of truth. But standing here, he wondered if there were some things not meant to be found. Yet he had come too far to turn back. He reached out, his palm hovering just above the stone. A warmth pulsed beneath his fingers, rhythmic, steady, alive. Then the silence broke. A deep, resonant thrum echoed through the chamber, vibrating through the rock itself. The runes on the door flared, the dim glow sharpening into something more. Something bright and sharp, like a blade catching firelight. Doran took a step back, his expression grim. "It knows we're here." The mountain itself seemed to groan in response. A slow, deliberate sound, like stone shifting far beneath the surface. The very air thickened, pressing against them. Then, with a sound like grinding rock, the great doorway began to move. Dust cascaded from the ceiling as ancient mechanisms stirred to life. Gears and levers, unseen, shifting within the depths of the mountain. The door trembled. Then, with agonizing slowness, it began to slide open. A gust of warm air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of old fire. And something else, something metallic, bitter, and strangely sweet. Arundel swallowed, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword. "Be ready." The door groaned wider, revealing the darkness beyond. The firelight from their torches barely reached past the threshold, swallowed by the cavernous expanse within. Shapes loomed in the blackness, pillars, massive and angular, stretching high into unseen heights. Faint embers pulsed within the deep, casting eerie glows that flickered like dying stars. And then a sound, not the shifting of stone, not the whisper of wind through tunnels long forgotten. Something deeper, something rhythmic, breathing. Doran's grip on his axe tightened. Something lives here. Thalen's expression was unreadable, but her body was tense, poised. "Not something," she murmured. "Many things." The realization settled upon them like cold iron. This was no mere ruin, no mere relic of an age gone by. The forge had not been abandoned. It had endured. Arundel took a slow step forward, crossing the threshold. The others followed, their torches sending restless shadows dancing across the stone. The chamber beyond was vast, stretching beyond sight. The ceiling arched high above, lost in the gloom, supported by pillars so massive they seemed like the ribs of the mountain itself. Great forges, long thought to be cold, still smoldered with the glow of embers buried deep in their bellies. Anvils, tools, the remnants of work long unfinished lay scattered among the stone, and in the far reaches of the forge, something moved, a figure indistinct in the dim light shifted within the shadows. It was hunched over a great anvil, its form silhouetted against the faint glow of molten metal. It did not turn, did not acknowledge their presence, but its movements were deliberate, methodical. It was working, the breath caught in Arundel's throat. This place was supposed to be lost, forgotten, yet here it stood, waiting, and they were not alone. The forge was alive. The embers in its belly pulsed, casting restless shadows along the cavern walls. The air was thick with heat, not the lifeless warmth of long-cooled stone, but something deeper, something that breathed. Ash swirled lazily in the dim light, disturbed by their presence, as though the mountain itself had exhaled in recognition of them. The figure at the anvil did not move. It stood hunched, its outline barely visible against the molten glow. Its presence unnatural, too still, too deliberate. The rhythmic clang of metal striking metal had ceased, yet something lingered in the air, like the remnants of an unfinished thought. Then slowly it straightened. The silence in the cavern was absolute. Arundel's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. Doran shifted his weight, his axe gripped with the quiet readiness of one who had seen too many battles. Baron's fingers hovered near his belt, where his dagger gleamed in the dim light. Thalen did not move, but her breath was measured. Her silver eyes locked onto the figure as if she were waiting for something. It did not turn to face them immediately. Instead, it lifted its hands. Black iron gauntlets gleamed faintly in the firelight, the metal worn smooth by years, centuries of toil. The fingers curled, slow, deliberate, as though remembering the motion of creation. Then, with no sound at all, the figure turned. The face that emerged from the shadows was not flesh. It was iron, a mask blackened by soot and flame, smooth and unbroken save for the deep slits where eyes should have been. Yet, there was no light within them, no glimmer of life, only darkness. Doran muttered something low in Kuzdal, his stance shifting as if readying for battle. Baron took a step back. It's not alive. Thalen's voice was quieter, but steady. Not in the way we understand. Arundel swallowed, forcing his voice to remain calm. Who are you? The figure did not answer, did not move. Then slowly, it lifted its hand, The forge answered. A low, resonant thrum spread through the chamber, the embers flaring brighter in response. The ancient anvils, the molten rivers of ore, the scattered tools, all trembled in recognition of its will. The air thickened, and with it, a whisper that was not sound, but something deeper, something felt rather than heard. You should not have come. The voice did not belong to the figure alone. It resonated through the stone, through the forge, through the very mountain itself. It was old, not the voice of a man, nor an elf, nor even a dwarf. Something beyond such things. Thalen's hand closed into a fist at her side. The forge is not empty. Arundel exhaled, steadying himself. Then what remains? The iron mask tilted slightly, almost in curiosity. Then the whisper returned, curling through the cavern like smoke. We are the makers. The embers flared brighter, and with them, the forge pulsed alive, aware. Doran's jaw tightened. Morgoth's smiths, he muttered. Thalen nodded grimly. The ones who did not die. Baron's expression darkened. You mean they still live? Thalen shook her head. Not as they were, not as anything should. Arendel's breath came slow and measured. He had read of such things in old records, whispers of those who had served the first Dark Lord, who had been twisted by his will, who had forged weapons not merely of iron, but of darkness itself. They had not been mere craftsmen. They had been creators of destruction, bound to fire, bound to war. And now, after all these years, they had found one, or what remained of one. Arundel took a step forward. The forge still burns, he said. Why? The figure's masked face remained unreadable, but the whisper curled around them again. Because the work was never finished. A chill settled over the group. Despite the heat radiating from the chamber, Arundel narrowed his eyes. What work? The figure did not answer, but it did not need to. In the depths of the forge, something shifted. Another breath, another stirring of unseen forces. Then the glow of the molten ore began to pulse, not randomly, not as dying embers, but in rhythm, a steady, deliberate heartbeat. And suddenly, Arundel understood. They weren't just making weapons, he murmured. Thalen's expression darkened. No, she said. They were making something else. Doran inhaled sharply. Then the question is, did they finish it? The figure took a step forward. The sound was wrong, not the step of a man upon stone, but something heavier, something unnatural. It was not bound by flesh or muscle. It was something else. Arendel's fingers tightened on his sword. Enough, he said, his voice firm. This place should have remained buried. The whisper curled around them again, laced with something almost amused. And yet here you are. The air thickened, The embers flared, and behind the forge, something moved. A slow, grinding sound filled the cavern, deep as the shifting of the earth itself. Behind the great anvil, beyond the pools of embers, something stirred in the darkness. It was not the figure of iron that had spoken, nor was it mere shadow. It was something vast, something ancient. The forge had never gone cold, because something within it had never stopped breathing. The forge exhaled. A gust of heat swept through the cavern, carrying the scent of molten metal, and something older, something sharp, bitter, unnatural. The poolsing embers swelled, their glow deepening into a smoldering red, casting long, jagged shadows against the stone. The grinding noise did not stop. It rumbled beneath their feet, low and deliberate, as though the very bones of the mountain were shifting. Then, from behind the great anvil, it emerged, a shape dark as iron and wreathed in heat and shadow, pulled itself from the depths of the forge. It was no dragon, not in the way smog had once darkened the skis of Middle-earth. This was something lesser, yet somehow more terrible. A remnant of the First Age, a thing forged rather than born, a construct, a weapon, a sentinel of Morgoth's will. Doran's breath came sharp. A golem. Thalin's expression was grim. No mere construct, she murmured. It has a purpose. The golem moved, its massive form grinding against the stone. Its surface glowed with heat, as though it had just been pulled from the heart of the forge itself. Molten veins pulsed through its blackened hide, shaping it not from flesh, but from charred iron. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow pits, filled only with fire. Doran let out a quiet curse in Khuzdul. Baron's hand twitched toward his dagger. "If it still moves," he said, his voice tight, "if it still lives, then that means it was never abandoned." Arundel's grip tightened on his sword. "No," he murmured. "It was waiting." The golem let out a sound, not a roar, not a breath, but a deep, mechanical groan that vibrated through the cavern walls. And then, with terrifying speed, it moved. It struck first. An arm of molten metal swung outward like a hammer. Arundel barely had time to react before the force of the blow sent a wave of hot air scorching toward them. The company scattered, rolling behind fallen anvil blocks and broken pillars as the impact shattered the stone where they had stood. "Move," Thalin's voice cut through the chaos. Doran was already in motion, his dwarven reflexes carrying him low and fast as he ducked beneath another strike. His axe gleamed as he swung, but when the blade met the golem's iron hide, it barely left a mark. Sparks flew, but the creature did not slow. Baron was the next to move quick, sharp. He threw a dagger with deadly precision toward the thing's hollow eye. The blade struck true, embedding itself in the molten metal. The golem only seemed to grow hotter. Thalen cursed. Weapons will not break it. Arundel's mind raced. This thing had not been built like an ordinary machine. It had been crafted, imbued with dark will, shaped in fire that was more than mere heat. It was not something that could be destroyed with simple steel. But then how? His eyes scanned the forge. Then he saw them. The runes lining the chamber walls. The script Thalen had spoken of before. Wards, not merely to keep intruders out, but to hold something in. A cage, and a cage, if broken, could be undone. Thalen, Arundel shouted. The runes, what do they say? She ducked beneath another blast of heat, her cloak whipping around her. They bind, she called back. This place was not made to forge weapons alone. It was meant to contain them. Arundel's mind clicked into place. Then we break the bindings. Doran let out a sharp laugh, dodging another strike. And if that just sets it free, Arundel clenched his jaw. Then, at least, it will no longer be tied to this forge. He met Thalen's gaze. It will be mortal. She was already moving. She sprinted along the edge of the chamber toward the nearest glowing rune. Unsheathing her blade, she slashed through the ancient marking. The light flickered, then shattered, sending a ripple through the room. The golem staggered. It did not fall, but something in its movement faltered. Something in its form wavered, as though part of the force binding it had been severed. It's working, Thalen called. Baron was already at the next rune, dagger in hand, slicing through another marking. Again, the energy pulsed outward. The golem let out a metallic howl. Its molten veins flickered, as if struggling to hold shape. Doran grinned. Then, let's see how much it can take. He raised his axe, bringing it down onto another rune. The stone shattered under the force of his strike. The forge groaned in response, and the golem reeled. Its body flickered, shifting between solidity and something less tangible, less bound to form. Arundel ran to the final rune, his blade flashing as he severed the last sigil. A final shockwave tore through the forge. The golem let out a sound unlike anything before, a distorted, wailing roar that seemed to stretch through time itself. Its molten body flickered. Its limbs lost cohesion. The iron crumbled into slag as the bindings that had held it together failed. And then, with a final shuddering breath, it collapsed. The cavern went still. For a long moment, none of them moved. The heat in the air slowly faded. The embers in the forge dimmed, no longer fed by the presence of what had dwelt within it. Thalen exhaled, lowering her blade. It is done. Doran let out a low breath. But I don't think this place will hold much longer. He was right. The walls had begun to tremble. The mountain itself groaned, as though it had lost something vital. Baron swore, "Time to leave." Arundel nodded, "Move." And as the forge behind them crumbled, they ran. The mountain trembled, waking from a long slumber, its very bones shuddering with the force of something ancient unmade. The forge was collapsing. Stone cracked. Dust rained from the cavern ceiling. The once glowing runes along the walls flickered and died, their energy severed, their power lost. "Go," Arundel shouted, his voice barely cutting through the roaring din of falling rock. The company sprinted across the chamber, their boots echoing against the quaking stone floor. The great anvil at the forge's heart groaned under its own weight, tilting as the foundations beneath it gave way. The iron-masked figure, the last remnant of the long-dead smiths, stood motionless, staring at the dying embers as if it had no purpose left. Arundel did not look back. The tunnel leading out of the forge was already beginning to collapse. Fissures split, spidering through its walls. Choking dust filled the air, turning their desperate flight into a blur of shifting shadows and fading firelight. The heat still clung to them, but it was different now. No longer a living thing, no longer something watching from the dark. The presence that had lingered for so long was gone. They ran. Baron leapt over a crack that had split the stone beneath them, catching himself with a curse. "It's coming down too fast." Doran, his sturdy dwarven legs carrying him with surprising speed, barely dodged a falling slab of rock. The mountains settling. Whatever was holding this place together, it's failing. Arundel gritted his teeth. The forge had endured for centuries, waiting, lingering. Its power had been bound to the dark will that had created it. Now, with that will severed, the mountain was swallowing it whole. Thalen was ahead of them, moving with the fluid grace of the Eldar. Her silver cloak billowed behind her as she weaved between the crumbling pillars. She glanced back once, her expression unreadable. The entrance is near. A fresh quake rolled through the tunnel, sending another shower of stone cascading from above. A massive chunk of the ceiling cracked, breaking loose, and came down right in their path. Arundel skidded to a halt, his breath sharp. The way forward was blocked. For a single heartbeat, the dust swirled in the dim glow of their dying torches. The weight of the moment pressed upon them. They had come too far. They could not die here. Baron exhaled sharply, running a hand through his sweat-drenched hair. "Tell me you have another way out." Doran ran his hands over the wall, feeling for weaknesses. "There's always another way," he muttered. "But finding it before we're crushed, that's another matter." Arundel's mind raced. The tunnel had been carved by hands that that understood stone, understood the shape of the mountain itself. If there was a main entrance, there had to be. His gaze snapped upward. There, a narrow fissure split the rock above them, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. It was not an exit, not yet, but it could be. Doran followed his gaze, then let out a breath. A weakness in the stone. His grip tightened on his axe. I can widen it. Thalen nodded, then do it fast. The dwarf didn't need to be told twice. He stepped forward, hefting his weapon, and with a mighty swing, he struck the rock. A deep crack split through the stone, widening the fissure. Dust billowed outward, but the passage was still too small. Baron was already beside him, driving a dagger into the weakest point, prying the jagged edges apart. You sure this won't just bring the whole place down on us? Doran grunted. We'll find out soon enough. Arundel could feel it now beyond the opening, a rush of fresh air. Thin, but real. The outside world. The mountain was closing in, but their path was still open. Almost there, Doran bellowed, swinging again. The crack widened, and then with one final strike, the stone gave. The fissure split wide, revealing an opening. A rough, jagged climb upward, but it led out. Thalen didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest edge, pulling herself up with effortless agility. Come. Baron followed, scrambling upward, his movements quick and desperate. Doran took a deep breath. If this passage collapses while I'm in it, I'll haunt you for the rest of your days. Move, Arundel snapped. The dwarf climbed, his sturdy frame hauling itself up with remarkable speed. Then it was Arundel's turn. He sheathed his sword, gritted his teeth, and grabbed hold of the rock. The mountain groaned. The forge behind them gave one last, shuddering exhalation. A deep, final tremor rocked the tunnel as the last of the enchanted stone failed, collapsing inward. A great rush of heat surged through the passage, like the dying breath of a forgotten age. Arundel pulled himself up, lungs burning, every muscle screaming. The rock beneath his feet shifted, and suddenly he was falling. Thalen's hand caught his wrist. For a heartbeat, he dangled over the collapsing forge, the fiery ruin yawning beneath him. Her grip was strong, unyielding. Hold on, she hissed. He did. With one final pull, she hauled him over the edge. He rolled onto solid ground, gasping. And then, behind them, the mountain sealed itself. The final collapse sent a plume of dust billowing outward. The sound a deep, mournful roar that echoed into the sky. The entrance was gone. The forge was gone. For a long moment, none of them spoke. They simply lay there, staring up at the sky, gasping for breath. The stars shimmered above, cold, distant, utterly indifferent what had just been buried beneath the world. Baron was the first to speak, his voice rough. Well, that was unpleasant. Doran let out a breathless, shaky laugh. I'd rather not do it again. Thalen sat up, brushing dust from her cloak. It is done. Arundel slowly pushed himself to his feet, limbs aching. He turned to look at the sealed mountain. It stood silent now, as it should have remained for centuries. Whatever had been waiting within was lost once more, buried by the weight of the world itself. Yet even as he looked at it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. That deep beneath the stone, the embers still smoldered, waiting. The past was never truly gone, only buried. Doran clapped a hand on his shoulder. Come, let's get away from this cursed place. Arundel exhaled, then nodded. Without another word, they turned away from the mountain and began their long journey home. Behind them, the withered heath lay silent, and far beneath, deep in the heart of the world, the last breath of the forge still flickered, waiting